Good to see you again this evening. Here is History Lullaby. Tonight we'll be covering all the downright strange things people did in Victorian Britain. Before we wander through this curious cabinet of Victorian oddities, do me one small favor. Tell me where you're listening from. Hit that subscribe button if this story helps you sleep effortlessly. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. Victorian Britain liked to think of itself as the very definition of progress. The factories belched, the railways thundered, and the empire stretched smugly across maps and schoolrooms from London to Kolkata. The great exhibitions paraded the triumph of industry beneath glass palaces where engines gleamed and telegraphs buzzed, proof that reason and refinement had finally triumphed over superstition and ignorance. Here at last was a society convinced it had risen above the crude eccentricities of its ancestors. To be Victorian was to be modern, civilized, and enlightened. Or so the story went, and yet the reality was rather less flattering. Beneath the polished speeches about progress lurked habits that would have baffled and appalled their Roman or medieval predecessors. In their pursuit of refinement, Victorians lined their drawing rooms with arsenic-laced wallpaper, drank tea beside coal fires that blackened their lungs, and decorated their mantels with locks of human hair twisted into sentimental jewelry. They powdered their faces with mercury, laced their corsets until organs shifted, and took comfort in the belief that a knock on the table might be a visiting spirit rather than the housemaid. To live in Victorian Britain was to inhale poison in the name of beauty, to risk mutilation in the name of fashion, and to sit politely while someone attempted to summon the dearly departed after dessert. The contradiction was almost an art form, a people who declared themselves rational while drowning in superstition, who embraced science yet adored pseudoscience, and who prized morality while quietly indulging in excess. To modernize, their lives seemed grotesque comedies of self-destruction, but to them, these were daily markers of respectability. Strange as it may appear, every ritual and every hazard was dressed in the language of propriety, civilization, and taste. It was not enough simply to live. One had to die, decorate, and even suffer with style. And nowhere was this peculiar obsession more vividly displayed than in the rituals surrounding death itself. If you lived in Victorian Britain, death was not simply an interruption. It was a performance, one that demanded rehearsal, costume, and above all, discipline. Funerals were not the private affairs of grief we might imagine today, but public spectacles of respectability. To die well was to remind your neighbors that you had lived properly. To mourn correctly was to advertise your family's virtue to the entire parish. Black horses were hired, draped in plumes that bobbed theatrically as they carried the hearse down city streets. Windows were curtained, bells tolled, and households with enough money draped their doorways in black crepe that smelled faintly of dust and dye. Even the poorest scraped together coins for a proper coffin, because to be buried without pomp was considered not only tragic, but shameful. Death in the Victorian imagination was never silent. It was orchestrated, rehearsed, and displayed like an amateur theater production in which everyone had a role to play. Mourning attire was its own elaborate uniform, complete with strict rules of etiquette. Widows were expected to wear deep black for years, sometimes their entire lives, the crepe fabric scratching against their skin and carrying the unmistakable chemical scent of dye and starch. Men's mourning was shorter and simpler, but no less visible. Black armbands or hatbands marked them as participants in the ongoing drama of bereavement. There were even mourning bonnets, mourning jewelry, and mourning stationery. Each item reinforced the impression that grief was something you could and should advertise on your body. The wrong fabric, the wrong duration, or the premature shedding of black was noted, whispered about, and remembered by watchful neighbors. Mourning was not about personal comfort. It was about conforming to a code that turned private loss into public duty. The obsession with ritual extended into the curious world of post-mortem photography. In an age when few families could afford to have portraits painted or photographs taken in life, death offered the final chance to capture a likeness. Children were dressed in their best clothes, propped in chairs with their siblings, their stillness convenient for the camera's long exposure. Adults were arranged in beds, sometimes made to look as though they were sleeping. other times upright with eyes painted open on the photograph itself. The result was an uncanny mixture of intimacy and horror, a final family portrait in which one subject no longer participated. To modern sensibilities, it seems grotesque. To the Victorians, it was both practical and sentimental. A last image to remember, proof that the deceased had once lived and belonged to a family who cared enough to preserve them in silver nitrate. Hair jewelry carried the same unsettling combination of sentimentality and craft. Locks of hair were clipped from the deceased, washed, and woven into rings, necklaces, and elaborate brooches. Some were braided like fine rope, others twisted into intricate floral designs beneath glass. A mother might wear her dead child's hair close to her throat, while lovers could exchange plaited strands set in lockets. To run your fingers across such a piece was to touch the literal remains of a person brittle, slightly greasy with age, and oddly enduring compared to the body that decayed underground. The Victorians considered this both tender and tasteful, a way of holding a fragment of someone long after flesh and bone were lost. To us, the idea of wearing human hair on your chest might sound morbid. To them, it was a keepsake, more durable than memory itself. Death masks served a different purpose, but were no less unnerving, made by pressing plaster onto the face of the deceased. They preserved not just the likeness, but the final expression. Some were cast in wax or bronze, displayed in drawing rooms as if they were busts of Roman emperors. The effect was chilling. Familiar features stiffened into immobility, eyes forever closed, lips forever sealed. To own such an object was to insist that the presence of the dead lingered tangibly in the home, a constant reminder of mortality. Friends could call, admire the resemblance, and nod approvingly at the tastefulness of preserving such a relic. In a society that measured respectability through displays of seriousness and sentiment, a death mask was as much a status symbol as a family portrait hung in the hall. Children were often the focus of these practices, but disease carried them off in alarming numbers. Infant mortality was so common that mourning rituals for children became their own subgenre. Tiny coffins were lined with satin. Mourning dolls were dressed in the clothes of the lost child, and photographs were posed with surviving siblings who were instructed to hold the body gently as though it might stir again. The sweetness of childhood was transformed into a sentimental tableau, one that blurred the line between grief and exhibition. For Victorians, to lose a child was devastating, but to fail to memorialize the child properly was equally unthinkable. Death was not hidden away. It was brought forward, dressed up, and preserved as art. Even the smells of mourning carried meaning. Black crepe wafted faintly of dye and dust. Funerary flowers wilted into sweetness edged with rot, and the heavy perfumes of embalming powders clung to rooms for days. The sensory assault was deliberate, reminding everyone who entered a home that death had visited, and respect was required. Sound, too, was orchestrated. The muffled toll of bells, the clip of hooves on cobblestones, the hush of whispers in drawing rooms draped in black. Grief was not silent. It was staged, scented, and sounded so that even those passing in the street could sense its presence. The elaborate nature of these customs was not purely about emotion. It was also about social control. Mourning offered a way to prove respectability, demonstrate piety, and assert moral seriousness. To neglect the rituals was to risk being judged careless, irreligious, or even unfeeling. In a society obsessed with appearances, grief was another performance, and one in which the stakes were reputational as much as emotional. Just as fashion dictated the cut of a gentleman's coat or the height of a lady's bonnet, so mourning dictated the thickness of crepe, the duration of black, and the proper moment to re-enter society. One's very grief was subject to scrutiny and gossip. The oddity of all this is not that Victorians loved their dead, but that they managed to transform love into an industry. Entire trades flourished on mourning. Undertakers, photographers, jewelers, mask makers, and fabric merchants all found profit in grief. Catalogs advertised mourning attire with the same briskness as they sold parasols and gloves. Shops specialized in black crepe and jewelry woven from hair, ensuring that grief could be both sentimental and socially conspicuous. Death was not only an inevitability, but an economic opportunity woven into the fabric of daily commerce. Respectable grief required shopping, and respectable families knew how to spend. What strikes the modern observer most is how these customs blurred the boundary between life and death. The deceased were not simply buried and forgotten. They lingered in photographs, in lockets, in wax busts on mantels, in the very fabric draped around survivors' bodies. To walk through a Victorian home was to encounter the dead in subtle, pervasive ways. They were stitched into jewelry, framed on walls, pressed into plaster, and perfumed into the air. The Victorians did not leave their dead in cemeteries. They invited them back into their houses, their wardrobes, and their parlors, insisting that grief be lived with daily, visible, and inescapable. The result was a society where mourning was as ordinary as tea drinking. It was ritualized, commodified, and deeply woven into the rhythms of life. For the Victorians, death was not a private fracture, but a communal display, one that reinforced values of propriety, discipline, and sentiment. They could not prevent cholera, consumption, or childhood fevers, but they could shape the appearance of grief into something dignified. Even as disease ravaged homes, respectability demanded that suffering be dressed in crepe and braided into jewelry. If mourning rituals filled Victorian streets with plumes and black crepe, the domestic world was no less theatrical. The home was meant to be a sanctuary of respectability, a fortress of moral order against the chaos of industrial cities. Families prided themselves on their parlors, those carefully arranged spaces lined with drapes, rugs, and wallpaper chosen to display refinement. Yet, for all their polished appearances, these interiors concealed a quiet menace. The hearth was supposed to be safe, a place of tea, prayer, and family portraits, but it was in truth a laboratory of toxins. Every chair, every carpet, every painted wall might betray its occupants. Death did not always wait outside the door. In Victorian Britain, it often seeped silently from the very furnishings purchased to prove taste. The most notorious culprit was wallpaper. Bright colors were fashionable, particularly the vibrant emerald shade known as Shields green, made possible by arsenic compounds hung in drawing rooms and bedrooms. These wallpapers glowed with vivid life, a statement that the household kept pace with the latest aesthetic trends. But as the paper aged and damp settled into plaster, tiny flakes detached and floated invisibly through the air. Inhaling them meant bringing arsenic directly into the lungs. Touching them meant absorbing poison through the skin. Symptoms ranged from nausea and rashes to fatal illness. Though the connection was often denied or politely ignored, it was difficult, after all, to admit that one's lovely parlor, so recently admired by guests, might be indistinguishable from a slow-acting gas chamber. The irony was that manufacturers and doctors knew perfectly well that arsenic was lethal. It was sold, after all, as rat poison, and newspapers occasionally carried alarming reports of families who had fallen ill after redecorating. Yet the popularity of green wallpaper persisted because refinement demanded fashion, and fashion demanded risk. A visitor could step into a parlor and admire the rich emerald tones, perhaps pausing to comment on how modern the taste seemed. Only later, when they developed headaches or nosebleeds, would the thought arise that beauty had its price. The Victorians tolerated this ambiguity with remarkable patience, preferring elegance and social approval to plain walls and safety. Wallpaper was only the beginning. Paints, too, were infused with lead, especially the whites that brightened skirting boards and window frames. Children's toys painted in cheerful primary colors were often laced with the same pigment, and teething infants gnawed them with innocent curiosity. Lead, like arsenic, accumulated slowly, producing stomach pains, paralysis, and developmental disorders that no one fully understood, but many experienced. To paint a nursery in the fashionable style was to offer a child an invisible inheritance of poison. Yet to paint it any other way was to risk whispers about neglect or poverty. Beauty demanded pigment, and pigment demanded sacrifice. Coal, the great engine of the age, transformed Victorian skies into perpetual twilight. In cities like London or Manchester, the air thickened into choking fogs where visibility shrank to feet, and lamps were needed even at noon. This smog did not politely remain outdoors. It seeped into homes, blackening curtains, staining walls, and layering itself on lungs. Every breath carried the taste of ash. Every cough produced black phlegm. Yet to complain was to sound unpatriotic. But coal was the lifeblood of industry, proof of Britain's global dominance. Housewives scrubbed and laundered endlessly, fighting a losing battle against soot that clung to every surface. Respectability meant cleanliness, but cleanliness was unattainable in a world where the very air undermined it. The irony deepened further with domestic heating. Coal fires were the standard, and to sit by the hearth was to inhale not only smoke, but carbon monoxide and sulfur. Winter evenings by the fire offered warmth and conviviality, but also headaches and fainting spells. Children grew accustomed to coughing fits. Servants wheezed as they carried coal scuttles from room to room, and yet no one considered abandoning the tradition. The hearth was the symbolic center of the home, the place where morality and family unity were displayed. To remove it was unthinkable. Instead, families simply accepted that comfort required a trade warmth in exchange for lungs lined with soot. Even the furnishings themselves contributed to the slow assault. Carpets were treated with dyes that irritated skin. Upholstery stuffed with horsehair or straw carried mites, and mattresses were sewn with arsenical glues that released faint odors as bodies warmed them. A respectable parlor might look pristine, but to sit within it too long was to submit to a dozen low-level torments. Nausea, rashes, faintness, and strange fevers were common companions of refinement. The same families who boasted of their well-appointed homes also endured chronic illness with stoicism, never quite admitting that their taste in drapery or furniture might be to blame. Ventilation offered little relief. Windows were often kept closed to keep out soot, noise, and the suspicion of drafts, which Victorians believed caused everything from colds to cholera. Houses became sealed boxes where fumes from gas lamps, coal fires, and wallpaper mingled into thick air that sat heavy on the lungs. To walk into a Victorian parlor was to be enveloped in a cloud of odors: the tang of coal smoke, the sweetness of wilting flowers, the must of damp carpets, and the faint metallic bite of arsenic pigments. Guests complimented the decor while quietly enduring headaches, sore throats, and the creeping fatigue of slow poisoning. What makes all this stranger is how fervently Victorians embraced these hazards in the name of progress. The domestic interior was a stage, and every item on it a prop in the performance of respectability. The choice of wallpaper, the brightness of paint, the heaviness of drapes all signaled taste, refinement, and modernity. To strip a room of its fashionable colors or to forego the coal fire would be to abandon the performance, to risk looking provincial. And so families decorated their homes with poisons and sat proudly in rooms that sickened them, convinced that suffering was the price of civilization. Children, of course, bore the brunt, crawling across carpets steeped in dyes, sucking on painted toys, and breathing the same stale air, absorbing toxins from every angle. Infant deaths were often blamed on mysterious fevers, weak constitutions, or divine will, while the true culprits, arsenic, lead, and smoke, lingered invisibly in the nursery. Mothers mourned, fathers prayed, and undertakers thrived. Few paused to ask whether the very walls of their homes were conspiring against them, and even fewer would have changed their choices if they had. To be respectable was to follow fashion, and fashion demanded sacrifice from even the smallest bodies. The culture of denial was astonishing. Doctors occasionally warned of dangers, but their voices were drowned out by manufacturers, decorators, and the inertia of tradition. Arsenic wallpaper was defended as harmless, lead paint dismissed as trivial. Coal fog is described as an unfortunate necessity. Families clung to their poisons because they symbolized progress, and progress was not to be questioned. Better to cough through the night in a well-appointed bedroom than to admit that beauty was killing you. Respectability demanded discomfort, even illness. To live differently would be to risk ridicule or exclusion, and that was unthinkable. Thus, the Victorian home, that vaunted refuge of morality and family life, was in truth a slow, elegant trap. Every wall, every curtain, every toy participated in a quiet war against its inhabitants. The hearth offered warmth, but also poison. The parlor offered refinement, but also rashes, fevers, and slow, invisible suffering a domestic theater of controlled danger. The air was thick, lungs blackened, and yet the family gathered dutifully each evening, convinced they were partaking in the comforts of civilization. Home was not a sanctuary, but a stage set, and the performance demanded endurance. And when one stepped outside, the dangers hardly lessened. Streets were choked with coal fog, markets bustled with adulterated goods, and even the clothing worn on one's back carried hazards of its own. To leave the poisoned home was only to encounter new perils, for danger clung as tightly to fashion as it did to wallpaper. Today, a bad outfit might earn a raised eyebrow. In the Victorian era, it could set you on fire, crush your ribs, or drive you slowly insane. Clothing was not simply a matter of personal style, but of social survival, and survival demanded hazards. Respectability hung from every sleeve and hem, and no garment was too dangerous if it secured the right impression. A proper lady or gentleman did not dress for comfort. They dressed to prove they belonged, even if the very act of dressing threatened their lives. The most notorious culprit was the crinoline. Introduced in the mid-19th century, this vast cage of whalebone and steel extended skirts outward until women occupied entire doorways. The crinoline was admired for its elegance, its sculptural silhouette, and its ability to display acres of fabric, which of course also displayed a husband's wealth. Yet, the structure was awkward, catching on furniture, tripping its wearer, and sweeping small children or teacups into chaos. Worse, the crinoline was highly flammable. Brush too close to a fireplace, drop a candle at the wrong moment, and the whole skirt could ignite in seconds. Newspapers carried horrifying accounts of women consumed in flames, while bystanders struggled to reach their bodies through the expanding cage of hoops. The very garment that marked refinement could, in an instant, turn a drawing room into a crematory. Such deaths were not rare accidents, but grimly regular occurrences. Reports estimated that hundreds of women across Britain perished from burning crinolines each year. One poor girl in Dublin was said to have lit her skirts while bending over a hearth. Another in London caught fire at a ball when her gown brushed a gaslight. The stories were told with a mixture of pity and censure, for the implication was always that the victim had chosen fashion over safety. Yet this was a false choice, since society offered no real alternative. To appear without fashionable skirts was to risk ridicule or exclusion, better to risk immolation than to look provincial. Headwear offered no refuge. Men's hats, particularly the stylish felt varieties, were stiffened with mercury salts. Hatters exposed to the fumes day after day developed tremors, slurred speech, and madness so notorious it gave rise to the phrase, "mad as a hatter." Customers too absorbed traces of the metal, pressing poisonous brims to their brows in the name of respectability. A man might feel peculiar irritability, a tremble in his hand, or a slow decline in health. But the alternative, to appear hatless in public, was unimaginable. Social standing perched as precariously as the topper on his head, and both demanded sacrifice. Even footwear joined the parade of hazards. Boots were stiffened with glue and dyes that often contained arsenic or chromium, and prolonged wear caused blisters, ulcers, or strange discolorations of the skin. Shoes for women were narrow to the point of deformity, reshaping toes and arches in the pursuit of daintiness. For children, respectable boots were laced tight to train their feet early into proper form. The pain was accepted as the cost of appearing civilized, proof that one's body could be disciplined as firmly as one's manners. Perhaps the most emblematic garment of all was the corset. No respectable woman could be seen without one, and no fashion journal questioned its necessity. Corsets promised posture, elegance, and the enviable waistline of the hourglass figure. They also brought shortness of breath, digestive trouble, and slow displacement of internal organs. Doctors wrote disapproving tracts about the dangers of tight lacing, illustrating lungs compressed to half their size and livers dented into peculiar shapes. Yet the practice persisted, for to wear a corset loosely was worse than not wearing one at all. Society demanded the visible discipline of a cinched waist, a literal binding of the body into an acceptable silhouette. Women themselves defended the corset as a source of dignity. Letters to magazines argued that fainting was not the fault of tight lacing, but of poor constitution. Mothers laced their daughters early, training ribs and spines before puberty could rebel. Weddings, balls, and public events became competitions of endurance, with young women smiling politely while they could barely draw breath. A faint at the opera was almost a compliment, proof that the wearer had committed fully to fashion. Pain was not merely endured, it was displayed as virtue. Accessories carried their own perils. Mourning brooches made from jet or dyed black often leached chemicals onto skin, leaving burns or rashes. Cheap jewelry contained lead, absorbed slowly through the pores of the hand or ear. Gloves were dyed with aniline colors that irritated the skin, while face veils trapped coal smoke against the nose and mouth. Even parasols, designed to protect from the sun, were tipped with sharp metal points that occasionally caused injury. The full outfit of refinement resembled not so much a wardrobe as a catalog of minor torches. Each item looked harmless, but together they formed an arsenal of discomfort. Servants bore the hidden costs. They dressed and undressed their employers, inhaling dust of starch skirts and brushing soot from singed gowns. Laundresses scolded their hands on dyes and bleaches that removed stains from delicate fabrics. Milliners bent over feathers and ribbons until their eyesight failed, often succumbing to respiratory diseases from inhaling fibers all day. Fashion was not only hazardous to wear, it devoured the health of those who produced and maintained it. Every elegant gown represented countless invisible sacrifices stitched into its seams. The obsession with outward display meant these hazards were rarely acknowledged. Newspapers might report a death by fire, or doctors might lecture against tight lacing, but society moved on swiftly. To question fashion was to question morality itself, for clothing was considered an expression of character. A respectable woman wore what was required, regardless of risk. A respectable man placed his hat firmly on his head, mercury fumes and all. Suffering was not incidental. It was proof of discipline, of belonging, of superiority over those too poor or careless to dress properly. It is easy to mock these choices with modern hindsight, but the stakes were serious. Respectability governed access to marriage, employment, and social advancement. A family that neglected fashion risked isolation. In that sense, fashion hazards were not merely vanity, but survival strategies, however perverse. Better to lace one's ribs into deformity than to be thought unworthy of a good match. Better to risk fire in a ball gown than to remain unmarried in a plain frock. Appearances were not superficial. They were currency, and the currency was poisoned. Thus, the Victorian street was a parade of hazards in motion. Skirts that could ignite, hats that could unhinge the mind, boots that reshaped feet, and corsets that strangled lungs. Respectability shimmered in coal-fogged air, demanding obedience from everybody that moved beneath it. Clothing was not chosen for comfort, but for compliance, and compliance demanded suffering. Behind every graceful silhouette lurked the possibility of collapse. Behind every smile, the shadow of pain. Fashion was not an indulgence. It was a gamble played daily with one's body as collateral. And if the garments of respectability risked suffocation, poisoning, and spontaneous combustion, what hope could there be when one turned to medicine for relief? For the very doctors who warned against corsets or chemical dyes were often ready to prescribe remedies just as dangerous. If fashion was a performance of endurance, medicine was no less a theater of absurdity, where treatments could prove more lethal than the illnesses they were meant to cure. The 19th century congratulated itself on its medical progress. Hospitals were no longer simply waiting rooms for death, but sites of innovation. Chloroform and ether offered merciful oblivion during surgery. Antiseptic techniques promised to keep wounds clean, and microscopes revealed teeming new worlds of bacteria. To read the journals of the day was to hear the triumphant rhetoric of science lifting humanity out of ignorance. And yet, beneath these genuine breakthroughs, medicine retained a carnival quality. Alongside the surgeon's scalpel came an entire marketplace of bizarre remedies, quack devices, and poisons marketed with cheerful confidence. It was a century where you might find antiseptic in one hand and arsenic in the other, both dispensed in the name of health. Arsenic, so deadly in wallpaper, was also sold as a tonic for vitality. Chemists offered arsenic wafers, tiny tablets marketed to improve the complexion and invigorate the body. Women took them to whiten their skin, men to strengthen their vigor, and no one seemed disturbed that the same ingredient was used to kill rats. Advertisements praised the purity of these products, assuring customers that they contained just enough poison to do good without tipping into harm. The line between medicine and slow suicide was not merely blurred, but practically erased. Those who swallowed arsenic wafers may indeed have looked paler, but the accompanying symptoms, digestive distress, hair loss, nervous agitation, were quietly ignored. Vanity dressed itself as science, and apothecaries cheerfully supplied the means. Laudanum was another staple of Victorian health, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. It was prescribed for everything from headaches to indigestion and considered perfectly acceptable for children. Bottles of soothing syrups lined pharmacy shelves, their labels promising quiet nights for fretful infants. Mothers spooned opiates into babies' mouths, grateful for the silence that followed. While never questioning the long-term effects on developing brains, an entire generation of children grew up in a haze of chemical pacification, some never waking from their medicated slumbers. The bottles were sold openly, their contents unregulated, and addiction was rarely acknowledged until it was too late. What we would now call negligence was in Victorian Britain a matter of convenience. The adult population was no safer. Laudanum became a quiet companion in countless households, consumed by respectable men and women alike. Writers like Cage and De Quincey turned their addictions into literary confessions, but for most it remained a private habit. A solicitor might keep a bottle in his desk for nervous strain, a housewife in her cabinet for female troubles. Doses crept upward, tolerance built, and lives slowly unraveled under the weight of dependence. Yet to admit addiction was shameful, and so the bottle remained discreetly on hand, as ordinary as tea or sugar. The culture of restraint that governed manners and dress proved powerless against the seductive promise of chemical escape. Not all remedies came in liquid form. The Victorian period saw a flourishing trade in electrical devices advertised as the cutting edge of science. Belts and harnesses embedded with wires or plates were strapped around waists, arms, or genitals, promising to restore vitality, cure impotence, and banish vague nervous ailments. Patients were assured that the invisible power of electricity coursed through their bodies, realigning energies and awakening dormant functions. In practice, most devices delivered little more than a mild tingle or occasional burn. Yet the illusion of modernity was persuasive, and men desperate for virility, or women weary of chronic fatigue, purchased these contraptions with hope that bordered on credulity. Electricity was fashionable, and fashion as ever trumped evidence. The pursuit of health often disguised itself as the pursuit of morality. Victorian society pathologized sexual desire, diagnosing hysteria in women and weakness in men, then offering treatments that were as revealing as they were absurd. Doctors prescribed pelvic massages and later mechanical vibrators to cure female patients of anxiety, sleeplessness, or melancholy. The treatment was presented as respectable medical practice, carried out in clinics or even at home. To modernize, it appears transparently sexual. Yet within Victorian culture, it was cloaked in clinical language. Patients emerged flushed and temporarily relieved. Doctors billed for their services, and the cycle continued. The line between therapy and indulgence blurred, all under the reassuring banner of science. Other cures bordered on the theatrical. Bloodletting, though in decline, still persisted in the early decades, with leeches applied to temples or chests to drain away supposed excess. Tonic wines infused with cocaine were sold to the weary, promising renewed vigor. Even cigarettes were advertised as treatments for asthma, the smoke allegedly opening airways rather than closing them. The sheer range of contradictions was breathtaking. Poisons as cures, stimulants as sedatives, narcotics as childminders. The market thrived because patients were desperate for relief, and because medicine was as much about performance as it was about results. The paradox extended into mental health. Melancholia, neurasthenia, and hysteria became fashionable diagnoses, particularly among the middle and upper classes. Treatments ranged from rest cures, where women were confined to bed and forbidden to read or write, to immersion in freezing baths to shock the nerves into compliance. Institutions flourished, filled with patients whose true ailments were less medical than social. Women unwilling to conform, men exhausted by industrial competition, individuals whose eccentricities defied respectability. The therapies inflicted upon them were often cruel, yet presented with solemn authority. Science offered discipline as well as healing, and sometimes the two were indistinguishable. The irony was that even as true medical breakthroughs emerged, antisepsis, anesthesia, public health measures, the public often gravitated toward the strange, the sensational, and the dangerous. There was comfort in a pill, a tonic, or a device, especially when it promised immediate results. Slow progress, like boiling instruments before surgery, lacked glamour. Swallowing arsenic wafers or strapping on an electrical belt felt modern, daring, and oddly reassuring. People wanted cures that looked like progress, even if they hastened decline. The credibility of science lent legitimacy to quackery, and commerce exploited the confusion. Medicine in the Victorian age thus operated on two stages at once. On one hand, surgeons and researchers genuinely transformed the practice of healing, reducing mortality and extending life. On the other, chemists and entrepreneurs peddled poisons and fantasies with equal conviction. Ordinary people stood in the middle, unable to distinguish reliably between miracle and menace. They placed their trust in bottles, belts, and powders, enduring side effects with stoic resignation. To be sick was to gamble, and the odds were rarely favorable. What lingers from this strange landscape is not only the danger, but the peculiar respectability that cloaked it. Taking laudanum was not shameful until addiction became obvious. Wearing an electrical belt was not absurd until it failed. The social veneer mattered more than the science. Health was not simply about living longer, but about appearing vigorous, controlled, and fashionable. Illness was seen as weakness, and weakness was intolerable. Medicine, therefore, served not only the body, but the image, just as clothing did. Treatments were judged not solely by efficacy, but by their ability to sustain the illusion of refinement. And so the line between medicine and vanity dissolved. The powders meant to heal often whitened skin. The syrups that soothed babies kept mothers respectable. The devices that promised vitality preserved reputations as much as health. Healing and appearance were entangled, one feeding the other, until the pursuit of medicine blurred seamlessly into the pursuit of beauty. If fashion demanded sacrifice, medicine offered no safer bargain, for it too was willing to trade health for the appearance of vitality. It is in this uneasy overlap that we arrive at the next stage of Victorian strangeness. The poisons and contraptions were embraced not for survival, but for vanity alone. In Victorian Britain, beauty was not an indulgence. It was a requirement, a form of social currency without which doors closed and opportunities vanished. A pale complexion, delicate features, and an air of refinement were not only admired, but demanded. Appearance was thought to reflect morality, and morality, in turn, was treated as evidence of worth. A sickly pallor could be read as sensitivity, while ruddy cheeks might imply vulgar labor in the Sunday. For women especially, beauty was survival. A marriage prospect could rise or fall on the shade of one's skin, the clarity of one's eyes, or the state of one's teeth. The pursuit of these ideals was not simply vanity, but necessity. And necessity pushed Victorians toward methods that often inflicted more harm than good. Paleness was the first requirement. To be bronzed or tanned suggested manual labor, the mark of a field hand rather than a lady of leisure. The solution came in bottles of skin-whitening creams laced with mercury or lead. These concoctions promised a flawless complexion unmarked by freckles or blemishes. The creams worked in a sense, for mercury did bleach the skin, but they also inflamed it, creating raw red patches that eventually scarred. Lead absorbed slowly into the bloodstream, producing fatigue, tremors, and in some cases, paralysis. Women painted their faces with toxins daily, watching the mirror for signs of improvement, even as their health deteriorated. They pursued smooth, pale skin to announce gentility, even if achieved through slow poisoning. The eyes, too, were subjected to chemical enhancement. Belladonna, an extract of deadly nightshade, was used to dilate pupils, creating the wide-eyed, languid look prized in paintings and poetry. A few drops produced an alluring darkness in the iris, a glassy brilliance thought to signal sensitivity and femininity. The side effects included blurred vision, headaches, and, with repeated use, permanent damage to the optic nerve. Women applied it nonetheless, fluttering their darkened eyes at dances and dinners, quietly enduring the dizziness that followed. Vision could be sacrificed for allure. Blindness was a distant risk compared to the immediate social penalty of appearing plain. Teeth presented their own set of problems. Sugar consumption soared during the 19th century, and dental hygiene had not yet kept pace. Rot, abscesses, and extractions left many with unsightly gaps. False teeth made from ivory, porcelain, or even human remains became essential for maintaining the illusion of health. Ivory yellowed quickly, porcelain clicked unnaturally when speaking, and human teeth, often harvested from battlefields or the mouths of the poor, carried their own grotesque history. Still, to display a full smile, even an artificial one, was to preserve dignity. Guests at dinner could overlook the taste of chalk and bread, but they would not forgive a mouth that betrayed poverty or decay. Cosmetics filled in the remaining gaps, though their use was complicated by Victorian morality. Overt paint on the face carried the stigma of immorality, associated with actresses or prostitutes. Respectable women preferred subtler methods: powders to soften complexions, rouges mixed with carmine or vermilion to add a discreet flush of color, enough to signal refinement without scandal. Many of these products were adulterated with lead or mercury, ensuring that even the most cautious user ingested a dose of poison. Perfumes and lotions, meanwhile, were laced with alcohols and irritants that inflamed sensitive skin. The ritual of daily application became both a declaration of refinement and a slow march toward chronic illness. The hair was another battleground. Dark, glossy locks were considered desirable, and a thriving market of dyes and tonics emerged to supply them. Many dyes contained lead acetate, advertised as restorative rather than chemical, and marketed with cheerful confidence. Regular use blackened hair but also discolored the scalp, leaving grayish patches that resembled bruises. Wigs and hairpieces offered alternatives, though they often carried the unmistakable odor of unwashed human hair. To pin a borrowed curl beside one's temple was to announce prosperity, but also to endure itching, heat, and the faint reminder of someone else's body. Beauty was rarely clean. Even nails and hands required their share of attention. Smooth, pale fingers indicated refinement, while rough or reddened hands betrayed labor. Women wore gloves constantly, even indoors, both to protect their skin and to mask imperfections. When gloves were removed, powders or ointments were applied to soften the skin, many of them containing arsenical compounds or harsh bleaches. A handshake could therefore carry not only the weight of social expectation, but also the faint sting of chemical residue. The smallest gestures of beauty, from eyes to fingertips, were performances supported by an invisible arsenal of poisons. What made these practices truly strange was not only their danger, but their earnestness. These were not secret indulgences, but widely marketed products advertised in newspapers and displayed in shop windows. Arsenical wafers, mercury creams, belladonna drops, all were sold openly, framed as scientific advances. The language of progress gave legitimacy to vanity, and vanity gave profit to apothecaries. No one thought it odd that substances known to kill rats or induce hallucinations were bottled as aids to beauty. To the contrary, their potency was a selling point. The harsher the chemical, the more likely it was to deliver results, however temporary. Men were not immune to this culture of appearance. Respectable gentlemen powdered their hair to disguise baldness, applied cologne to mask the pervasive stench of coal smoke, and submitted to tonics meant to invigorate their physiques. Beards, when fashionable, were oiled and combed to perfection. When unfashionable, the face was scraped raw by razors of uneven sharpness. Tobacco-stained teeth were polished with abrasives that wore enamel thin. Vanity was not confined to women, but permeated all classes and sexes, each adjusting their bodies to the expectations of the moment. The irony was that beauty in the Victorian age often left its devotees looking worse. The very creams meant to smooth the complexion caused rashes and sores. The drops intended to brighten the eyes clouded them instead. False teeth slipped, clacked, or discolored at inopportune moments. Yet to forego these aids was more dangerous socially than to endure their effects physically. Society demanded the illusion of health, not health itself. To appear delicate was enough. To actually be delicate was almost beside the point. Respectability thrived on appearances, and appearances were maintained at any cost. These routines were supported by a culture that equated beauty with morality. A pale woman was not only attractive but virtuous. Her fragility was interpreted as spiritual sensitivity. A man with gleaming teeth and polished boots was assumed to be industrious and reliable. Decay, blemishes, or visible illness carried moral implications, as though the body revealed the soul's failings. Cosmetics and contraptions were therefore not indulgences, but moral necessities, tools for shaping not only how one looked, but who one was presumed to be. The line between beauty and character blurred until they were indistinguishable. This relentless pursuit of appearance reveals a society deeply anxious about its own contradictions. Industrial smoke, blackened lungs, and stained teeth. Yet whiteness and clarity remained the standard of refinement. Disease stalked homes, yet vitality had to be displayed at all costs. The effort to maintain beauty in such conditions required endless chemicals, devices, and deceptions. Beneath the surface of Victorian refinement lay a body perpetually irritated, poisoned, and constrained, forced to present a mask of health while slowly undermining it. If Victorian clothing threatened to suffocate or ignite you, the food on your table was no less treacherous. The age of industry brought mass production to every corner of life, and meals were no exception. But progress in this case meant that adulteration and fraud became routine. The desire to stretch profits outweighed any concern for nourishment, and the result was that the average Victorian family ate a steady diet of deception. Bread was whitened with chalk or alum, beer was stretched with sawdust or strychnine, and sweets were brightened with lead-based dyes. In an era without strong regulation, the line between dinner and poison was alarmingly thin, and few consumers could be certain what exactly they were swallowing. Bread, the staple of the poor, suffered the worst abuse. To increase its weight and create the fashionable white appearance, bakers bulked their loaves with chalk, ground bones, plaster of Paris, or alum. The result looked respectable enough on the outside, but its taste was bitter and its effects corrosive on the stomach. Families consumed loaf after loaf of this counterfeit bread, mistaking its palate for purity. Investigations periodically exposed the practice, yet prosecutions were rare, and public outcry quickly faded. In a society where appearance carried more weight than substance, bread that looked refined was considered preferable to bread that was merely edible. Respectability once again triumphed over survival. Sweets, those small luxuries eagerly bought for children, were laced with even more grotesque additions. Confectioners relied on vivid dyes to make their wares appealing, and the cheapest, most dazzling colors were also the most dangerous. Red candies might contain lead oxide, green ones copper arsenite, and yellow lozenges chromate of lead. Children clutched bright sticks of sugar that glittered with poison, their tongues stained by the same chemicals used in paints and pigments. Illness and death followed, but the link was rarely acknowledged. After all, it was unthinkable that a parent's treat for a child could carry the same risks as wallpaper or cosmetics. The brighter the sweet, the more desirable it seemed, and so the market thrived. Beer, long the drink of the working man, became another victim of adulteration. Brewers stretched their product with sawdust, molasses, or even strychnine to give it a bitter kick. The resulting beverage could dull hunger and deliver intoxication, but it also poisoned livers and shortened lives. Alehouses brimmed with customers who accepted the harsh taste as normal, never suspecting deliberate fraud. Respectability in this case did not mean elegance, but cheap availability. A man staggering home from the pub was less a symbol of vice than a casualty of industrial creativity. Beer might quench the thirst, but it did so with ingredients more suited to a carpenter's workshop than a tavern. Milk was scarcely safer. To extend supply, sellers diluted it with water, sometimes drawn straight from contaminated pumps. Chalk or starch might be added to restore the appearance of creaminess. Infants fed on this counterfeit milk often fell ill, but the blame was placed on frailty rather than fraud. The very food most associated with innocence and purity became another vector of disease. The act of nursing a child with milk purchased from a street vendor could be indistinguishable from slow poisoning. Yet few families had the means to demand better. Trust in food was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Tea, meanwhile, was consumed in staggering quantities, its leaves adulterated with everything from dried twigs to iron filings. For the middle classes, tea was not merely a beverage, but a ritual, a daily performance of refinement. To gather around the table, pour from the pot, and discuss the events of the day was an expression of order and civility. That the tea itself might be fake or contaminated hardly mattered. The performance of drinking it was more important than the quality of the brew. Endless cups were consumed, each carrying a faint undertone of fraud, yet each reinforcing the illusion of stability in a rapidly changing world. The gin palaces represented the other extreme of Victorian drinking culture. These glittering establishments, lit by gas and mirrored walls, offered cheap gin to working-class patrons in quantities large enough to blot out entire evenings. Gin was denounced as the ruin of families, the enemy of morality, and the source of untold misery. Yet its appeal was irresistible, providing a swift and numbing escape from soot, hunger, and unrelenting labor. Respectable society wrung its hands at the sight of mothers staggering with children in tow, but the gin palaces multiplied regardless. In a world where bread was chalk and milk was water, at least gin delivered exactly what it promised: oblivion. Food adulteration was not limited to the poor. Middle and upper-class households prided themselves on lavish dinners. Yet even these tables carried dangers. Imported spices were often bulked with brick dust or ground nutshells. Wines were colored with additives to imitate age. Coffee might contain roasted peas or chicory rather than beans. The illusion of sophistication mattered more than authenticity. To serve a glittering feast, however compromised, was better than to admit to limitation. Guests admired the abundance while quietly enduring the gastric consequences. Respectability required display, and display required deception. What makes the whole spectacle remarkable is how willingly Victorians tolerated it. Periodic exposés by reformers revealed the scale of adulteration, and parliamentary inquiries documented the fraud in detail. Yet meaningful regulation arrived slowly, resisted by manufacturers, and dismissed by many consumers. The culture of appearances was so entrenched that even the possibility of poison did not outweigh the desire for refinement or cheap indulgence. To eat chalk bread was humiliating, but to eat coarse brown bread was worse. To drink adulterated tea was disappointing, but to drink no tea at all was unthinkable. The choice was never between health and danger, but between danger and disgrace. The sensory details of Victorian meals were therefore not only unappetizing, but quietly sinister. Bread with a faintly gritty texture, milk with a chalky aftertaste, sweets that left a metallic tang on the tongue, beer that burned the throat with bitterness not its own. To dine was to gamble, and every bite carried the possibility of sickness. Yet families gathered around tables with practiced cheer, thanking Providence for their sustenance, and rarely voicing doubts aloud. Respectability demanded gratitude, not suspicion. To question the meal was to question the entire social order that supplied it. Even in the homes of the wealthy, where genuine food could be procured, the emphasis was less on nourishment than on performance. Dinners stretched over hours, with course after course paraded before guests. The sheer abundance was meant not to satisfy, but to impress. Dishes were elaborately garnished, sauces rich to the point of nausea, meats cooked until gray but served with ceremony. The body might groan under the burden of digestion, but the reputation of the host shone. To eat excessively was not gluttony, but proof of prosperity. Health was an afterthought. Appearances remained paramount. The cumulative effect was that food in Victorian Britain was rarely a simple matter of sustenance. It was entangled in morality, class, and respectability, as much a performance as mourning rituals or fashion. The body became a stage upon which poisons, adulterants, and excess acted daily. If some died of malnutrition or intoxication, many more simply endured, adapting their stomachs to chalk, lead, and gin with stoic resignation. Meals were less about survival than about participation in a culture that prized appearances above all else. And yet, even in the midst of fraud and danger, food retained its central place in Victorian life. Tea soothed, gin numbed, bread filled, and sweets delighted children who had little else to smile about. That these pleasures were tainted did not lessen their cultural power. To eat was to belong, to participate in the rhythms of family, community, and nation. The risks were acknowledged but quietly ignored, folded into the price of progress. Victorians learned to swallow deception as readily as food, convinced that refinement justified the taste of poison. But food was not the only indulgence through which Victorians revealed their peculiar mixture of sentimentality and strangeness. The same society that tolerated chalk bread and lead sweets also extended its peculiar taste to the animal world. Pets, taxidermy, and performing creatures offered their own curious theater, a reminder that the appetite for the bizarre did not end at the dinner table. Victorian society prided itself on sentiment. Love of animals, in particular, became a fashionable display of gentility, a way to soften the edges of industrial life with a veneer of tenderness. Keeping a pet was not simply about companionship, but about proving refinement, about showing that even in the soot and chaos of a rapidly changing world, one had the leisure to care for creatures. Cats, dogs, birds, and rabbits became fixtures in respectable households. Their presence was as carefully curated as wallpaper or morning attire. A lapdog nestled on a sofa signaled prosperity. Only a family secure in its food and income could afford to feed an animal that served no purpose beyond affection. Yet beneath this cultivated sentiment, the Victorian relationship with animals often strayed into the grotesque, where love blurred with spectacle and tenderness gave way to cruelty. Taxidermy was one of the strangest expressions of this affection. When beloved pets died, their bodies were preserved, stuffed, and arranged in lifelike positions so that their presence might linger. Parlors displayed cats posed eternally on cushions, dogs forever caught mid-bark, or birds perched with glassy eyes. The practice expanded beyond simple preservation into elaborate scenes. Kittens, dressed in bonnets, gathered around miniature tea tables, squirrels posed in waistcoats playing cards, rabbits arranged as if conducting lessons at school. These dioramas were photographed, admired, and even exhibited in shop windows, a strange theater of domesticity rendered in fur and glass eyes. What was meant as tenderness became, in execution, a tableau of unsettling absurdity. The most famous practitioner was Walter Potter, whose Museum of Curiosities displayed thousands of such scenes to delighted visitors. Potter's kittens sipped tea, his guinea pigs married in churches, his rats drank ale in taverns. Visitors marveled at the ingenuity, laughing at the spectacle and praising the sentiment that inspired it. Yet beneath the laughter was the uncomfortable reality that countless animals had been killed or collected for these displays. The Victorians applauded themselves for their compassion toward animals, while simultaneously treating them as props for entertainment. Their bodies were transformed into decoration. The line between affection and exploitation blurred until it all but vanished. Live animals fared little better in the world of public spectacle. Performing animals were immensely popular, with trained bears, dogs, monkeys, and even elephants displayed in circuses and fairs. These performances were built as both educational and entertaining proof of mankind's ability to tame nature and impose order. Audiences applauded as dogs marched in formation, monkeys rode ponies, and elephants balanced on stools. The animals were beaten into obedience, their suffering hidden behind the glittering lights of the ring. For Victorians, the cruelty mattered less than the symbolism. Each act confirmed the belief that humans stood above animals, controlling them through wit and discipline. Entertainment was inseparable from domination. Menageries became another fashionable indulgence, particularly among the wealthy. Aristocrats and industrial magnates collected exotic animals in private estates, filling cages with lions, tigers, and monkeys. These private zoos served as demonstrations of wealth and global reach, proof that Britain's empire extended not only over lands and peoples, but over nature itself. Visitors could stroll through gardens and marvel at beasts brought from Africa, India, or the Americas, creatures torn from their habitats and displayed as trophies of conquest. The animals languished in cramped cages, poorly fed and rarely understood, but their suffering was eclipsed by the pride of their owners. To house a tiger in Surrey or a parrot in Manchester was to assert status regardless of the cost. Public zoos, too, reflected this peculiar combination of sentiment and domination. The London Zoo, established earlier in the century, became a popular attraction for families and tourists. Guides extolled the wonders of exotic species, framing the zoo as both amusement and education. Yet visitors left with an uneasy awareness of the hidden suffering behind the spectacle. Yet the animals were kept in enclosures barely suited to their size, pacing endlessly or slumping in misery. Visitors did not question their conditions, for the very act of seeing such creatures was thrilling enough. To watch a lion yawn behind bars was to feel the empire's reach made tangible. It was not cruelty in their eyes, but progress, a display of human mastery over the natural world. Even within homes, animals were subjected to the peculiar demands of fashion. Small dogs were dressed in costumes, paraded in carriages, or posed for family photographs. Birds were kept in cages, their wings clipped so they might never fly again, singing endlessly to amuse their owners. Cats were indulged or ignored depending on prevailing sentiment, but even they were sometimes dressed in dolls' clothing for amusement. Affection became performance, and the animals themselves became unwilling actors in their owner's pursuit of refinement. To treat an animal tenderly was a mark of sensitivity, but to treat it as an ornament was often considered equally acceptable. The paradox of Victorian sentimentality lay in its willingness to commodify even its own tenderness. The same society that cooed over kittens at play also organized bull-baiting spectacles until they were outlawed, and continued to enjoy dogfights in hidden corners. Humane societies were established, their rhetoric applauded, but cruelty persisted in both public and private. Animals occupied an uneasy place in the Victorian imagination, cherished as symbols of refinement, yet treated as objects of control and display. A lapdog in a bonnet or a parrot in a cage might evoke affection, but their very presence in those roles revealed the limits of compassion. What makes these practices particularly striking is the sheer normalcy with which they were embraced. A visitor entering a parlor might admire a taxidermy tableau without flinching, or laugh at a circus dog in costume without considering the training that had produced it. To question the treatment of animals was unusual, even suspect, for it risked challenging the broader culture of domination that underpinned empire, class, and gender. Animals were sentimental objects, but they were also convenient stand-ins for demonstrating control. To pose them, to parade them, or to collect them was to participate in a cultural performance that defined respectability. The sensory details of these entertainments were as unsettling as their premise. The stiff fur of a stuffed cat, preserved with chemicals and displayed on a shelf, carried the faint odor of dust and decay. The cries of a caged monkey echoed through a drawing room, strange and grating against the gentle clink of teacups. The sight of a lion pacing endlessly in a too small cage, its claws scraping against iron bars, was framed not as tragedy, but as marvel. Visitors congratulated themselves on their sensitivity while ignoring the suffering that surrounded them. Compassion was measured in sentiment, not in action. Even death did not end the performance. Just as hair was woven into jewelry to memorialize loved ones, pets too could be preserved beyond their natural span. Taxidermists advertised their services openly, promising to return a beloved companion restored for display. Families obliged, transforming animals into furnishings, as they had transformed human hair into ornaments. To live with stuffed cats or mounted dogs was not seen as grotesque, but as touching a reminder of affection that lingered beyond the grave. In this way, animals became absorbed into the same rituals of display and memorialization that shaped human mourning, further blurring the line between tenderness and absurdity. In the end, the Victorian relationship with animals reflected the broader contradictions of the age. Sentiment and cruelty coexisted comfortably, each reinforcing the other. To love an animal means to display it, to cage it, to pose it, or to stuff it. Affection was inseparable from domination, and tenderness was expressed through control. The same society that dined beneath gaslight with stuffed kittens arranged at tea also gathered after dinner to commune with the spirits of the dead. In both cases, reality mattered less than performance. Animals, like ghosts, were enlisted into the theater of Victorian respectability. Their presence was another prop in a world that blurred the line between compassion and spectacle. The Victorians liked to imagine themselves sober, industrious, and sensible. Yet, when it came to amusement, they had an appetite for the bizarre. Entertainment was equal parts wonder and grotesque, a theater of oddities, where curiosity blended seamlessly with cruelty and delusion. A day out might involve marveling at exotic beasts in a menagerie, gawking at human curiosities on stage, or dimming the lamps to listen for the knock of a ghost beneath the dining table. Amusement was not confined to music halls or parlors, but infused into daily life, turning the peculiar into the popular. It was as if, after enduring arsenic wallpaper, flammable skirts, and chalk bread, the Victorians demanded entertainment that was no less hazardous, only more openly absurd. Freak shows were among the most profitable spectacles of the age. Circuses, traveling troupes, and exhibition halls displayed individuals with physical differences, billing them as marvels of nature or punishments of God. Bearded ladies sat in silken gowns, dwarfs posed in military uniforms, and conjoined twins were paraded as wonders from distant lands. Audiences gawked, whispered, and applauded, paying for the privilege of staring at human suffering, reframed as theater. Promoters claimed the exhibitions educated the public, but in truth they catered to a mix of voyeurism and superiority. To witness someone different was to reassure oneself of normalcy, a comfort purchased for the price of a ticket. The performers themselves lived lives caught between exploitation and survival, profiting from a system that reduced them to curiosities. The tone of these shows was not always derisive. Victorians wrapped their gawking in the language of science, insisting that such exhibitions advanced knowledge of anatomy and heredity. Brochures described conditions in clinical terms, borrowing the authority of medicine to legitimize spectacle. A woman with excessive hair growth was no longer merely a curiosity. She was evidence of atavism. A man with dwarfism was displayed not simply as an object of amusement, but as a specimen for the amateur scientist. The veneer of education masked the reality of entertainment, turning human beings into living exhibits, cataloged for their strangeness. It was cruelty disguised as curiosity, and it thrived. If freak shows offered spectacle of the flesh, seances promised wonders of the invisible. Spiritualism swept across Victorian parlors, offering grieving families the chance to speak with their dead. Rooms were darkened, curtains drawn, and tables laid with candles and flowers. Mediums closed their eyes, muttered invocations, and summoned raps on wood or sudden gusts of cold air. Believers gasped as tables tilted or tambourines rattled in the dark. Convinced they had felt the presence of a lost child or husband, they found comfort in the performance. For a society obsessed with mourning and sentiment, seances offered both solace and theater. They combined grief with performance, weaving sorrow into entertainment that was at once solemn and absurd. The tricks were simple enough. Wires pulled bells, accomplices knocked beneath tables, and luminous paint made ghostly hands appear in the gloom. Mediums mastered ventriloquism, producing spectral voices in darkened rooms. Some even used telescoping rods to lift objects or brush the cheeks of sitters with feathers, creating the impression of spirit contact. The deception was obvious to skeptics, yet countless Victorians embraced it. The desire to believe, to sense a presence beyond the grave, outweighed suspicion. Fraud thrived in an atmosphere where grief and credulity collided, and audiences left seances not only comforted, but entertained. Table turning became a parlor game in its own right. Families gathered around dining tables, placing their hands lightly on the surface, waiting for it to tilt, spin, or tap out answers to questions. Newspapers described the practice with a mixture of awe and skepticism, while manufacturers rushed to sell lightweight tables specifically designed for the purpose. It was both entertainment and ritual, blending the intimacy of family gatherings with the thrill of the supernatural. Participants might laugh nervously as the table shuddered, then fall silent when it tapped out words or initials. The line between play and belief blurred until it was difficult to tell whether participants were indulging in a game or in genuine communion with the dead. Spirit photography offered another outlet for both grief and gullibility. Photographers discovered that by double exposing plates, they could produce ghostly figures hovering beside living subjects. Bereaved families sat stiffly for portraits, only to receive images in which pale, translucent forms rested a hand on their shoulders. The photographs were treasured as proof of survival beyond the grave, though in reality, they were clever manipulations of light and exposure. Studios profited immensely from the trade, selling not only images but hope. To hold a photograph that seemed to capture both life and death was to bridge the gap between mourning and spectacle, transforming grief into a marketable souvenir. Not all spiritualist phenomena were confined to parlors. Public demonstrations drew crowds eager to see mediums conjure apparitions, levitate tables, or materialize ectoplasm. Newspapers breathlessly reported on these events, some denouncing fraud, while others hinted at genuine miracles. The ambiguity only fueled fascination, yet even exposure did not always dampen belief. Fraudulent mediums unmasked one week could find audiences flocking back the next, eager for the thrill of being deceived. Entertainment did not depend on authenticity, but on the experience itself, the delicious uncertainty of wondering whether one had truly glimpsed the supernatural. The appetite for the grotesque extended beyond spirits and oddities to the theater itself. Melodramas reveled in sensational deaths. Operas staged suicides and murders. Penny gaffes offered crude entertainments where violence and comedy mingled freely. Public hangings, though largely phased out during the century, had long served as mass spectacles, drawing crowds that treated execution as both a moral lesson and carnival. Respectable society frowned at such vulgar amusements, but their popularity endured. Even in the playhouses of London's West End, audiences flocked to see ghosts, villains, and tortured heroines suffer under gaslight. Entertainment thrived on excess, and the grotesque was its most reliable currency. What united these varied amusements was their reliance on performance over substance. Freak shows pretended to educate. Seances pretended to console. Theaters pretended to uplift. Each offered a mixture of truth and fiction, carefully balanced to satisfy audiences without confronting them too harshly with reality. The suffering of performers, the deceit of mediums, the manipulation of photographers, all were subsumed into the larger spectacle of amusement. The Victorians consumed entertainment as they consumed food or fashion adulterated, hazardous, but dressed in the language of refinement. The sensory atmosphere of these amusements was as striking as their content. The damp air of a séance room, thick with candle smoke, the smell of sweat and sawdust in a circus tent, the cloying perfume of flowers on a theater stage, the musty odor of costumes worn too long without washing. Spectators craned their necks, gasped at illusions, and applauded with the same fervor whether the marvel was genuine or contrived. Entertainment was immersive, a full assault on the senses, designed to overwhelm skepticism with spectacle. The ordinary world of soot and labor receded, replaced by an extraordinary theater where anything, a ghost, a miracle, a deformity could be made to appear. The deeper irony lay in the way these entertainments blurred into other domains of Victorian life. Science lectures were staged with as much showmanship as a circus act, and spiritualist seances borrowed the language of research to mask their tricks. The boundaries between wonder, fraud, and inquiry were porous, each borrowing from the other to claim authority. What was amusing one evening could be presented as a serious demonstration the next, and audiences were often content not to press the distinction too far. In a society eager for spectacle, even science itself risked becoming just another form of theater. The Victorians loved nothing more than to remind themselves that they were living in an age of progress. Railways stitched the countryside together, their shrieking locomotives carrying passengers at unthinkable speeds. Telegraph wires spread across continents, reducing messages that once took weeks to mere hours. Great exhibitions filled cavernous glass palaces with machines, engines, and contraptions gleaming under gaslight, each promising to remake the world in iron and steam. It was a century that proudly proclaimed itself rational, industrious, and destined for greatness. To walk through a Victorian city was to be surrounded by the noise of invention, the clatter of trains, the flicker of electric experiments, the relentless hum of industry. Progress was not a vague idea, but a spectacle endlessly displayed and endlessly applauded. Yet even in this temple of reason, the Victorians found ways to indulge their appetite for strangeness. Alongside the locomotive and the telegraph, they eagerly embraced pseudosciences that promised to reveal hidden truths about the mind, body, and soul. Phrenology, for instance, became a fashionable obsession. Its practitioners ran their hands over skulls, mapping bumps and ridges with grave authority, declaring character and destiny inscribed in bone. A well-formed forehead might signal intelligence, while an unfortunate bump above the ear suggested criminality. Parlors filled with phrenological busts, their surfaces marked with neat divisions like atlases of the human psyche. People paid to have their heads measured, seeking reassurance about their moral worth or their children's potential. It was science stripped of rigor but rich in theater, a performance of certainty that satisfied a culture hungry for both classification and control. Mesmerism offered a different kind of spectacle. Borrowing the language of magnetism and invisible forces, mesmerists promised to cure ailments, reveal hidden thoughts, or even control the will of others. Demonstrations drew crowds as subjects were put into trances, their bodies rigid, their voices obedient to the mesmerist's commands. Audiences gasped as participants claimed to feel heat or cold at a mere gesture, or fell unconscious with a flick of the hand. Some physicians endorsed mesmerism as a therapeutic tool, while skeptics dismissed it as charlatanry. Yet its popularity endured, for it combined the allure of science with the drama of magic. To be mesmerized was to be part of a performance that blurred medicine, theater, and faith, each indistinguishable from the other. Electricity was another fertile ground for wonder. Public demonstrations showed sparks leaping between metal spheres, glowing bulbs lit by unseen currents, or volunteers jolted into spasms by experimental batteries. The sight of hair standing on end or limbs twitching involuntarily seemed proof of a mysterious power coursing through all living things. Enterprising lecturers staged elaborate shows, complete with music, costumes, and theatrical flair. Electricity became not only a subject of research, but a form of entertainment, a spectacle that reassured audiences they were witnessing the future. The fact that few truly understood what they were seeing did not matter. Progress was impressive, so long as it looked spectacular, and science that produced visible fireworks was taken as gospel. Anatomy demonstrations carried a similar blend of education and performance. Medical schools opened their lecture theaters to public audiences eager to watch dissections. Corpses, often obtained through dubious means, were laid bare as lecturers expounded on the wonders of muscle, bone, and organ. The smell of formaldehyde hung in the air, mingling with candle smoke and the uneasy curiosity of onlookers. What might have been grim or unsettling was reframed as progress, proof that knowledge triumphed over superstition. To attend a dissection was to prove oneself modern, willing to look death in the face in the name of science. It was also inevitably a form of spectacle, where education mingled with the grotesque thrill of seeing a human body opened before one's eyes. Even inventions that promised practical improvement often veered toward absurdity. Patents were filed for endless contraptions: mechanical beds to rock sleepless children, devices to resuscitate drowning victims by rolling them like barrels, and machines designed to feed soup directly into a patient's mouth without the need for spoons. Some inventions found genuine use, while others languished as curiosities, remembered only for their eccentricity. The line between ingenuity and nonsense was thin, and Victorians often applauded both with equal enthusiasm. What mattered was the performance of progress, the sense that discovery was constant, even if it produced more novelty than utility. This culture of invention fed the Victorian hunger for classification and control. Catalogues, exhibitions, and lectures presented knowledge as a neatly ordered universe, where skulls could reveal morality, magnets could reveal hidden powers, and sparks could reveal the secrets of life itself. It was a worldview that prized spectacle as much as accuracy. To see was to believe, and to be impressed was to be convinced. The rational age, for all its triumphs, retained a streak of credulity, ready to mistake the dramatic for the true. Audiences emerged from lectures or demonstrations not only entertained, but reassured that they lived in the most enlightened era humanity had ever known. The sensory details of these events only heightened their effect. The acrid smell of ozone at an electrical show, the heat of lamps glaring down on phrenological busts, the hush of anticipation as a mesmerist raised his hand, the metallic clink of instruments at a dissection. These were not abstract exercises in knowledge. but immersive experiences designed to overwhelm the senses and imagination. Participants went home with their heads buzzing, not necessarily with understanding, but with the conviction that they had glimpsed something marvelous. Science became, in many cases, indistinguishable from theater, its credibility inseparable from its ability to astonish. The irony was that genuine discoveries often struggled for attention beside such spectacles. Sanitation, vaccination, and careful statistical research lacked the immediate drama of sparks, trances, or skull maps. They saved lives, but failed to dazzle. The public preferred the showmanship of pseudoscience to the slow, unglamorous work of real medicine. Reformers fought uphill battles to convince audiences that clean water mattered more than table turning, or that vaccination did more good than belladonna drops. The Victorian passion for spectacle did not distinguish easily between what cured and what entertained. Both were consumed with equal enthusiasm, so long as they carried the aura of progress. In this way, the century's obsession with science was less about truth than about performance. The locomotive and the telegraph stood beside phrenological busts and mesmerists' wands, all part of the same cultural pageant. Knowledge was consumed not only in books or laboratories, but in drawing rooms, theaters, and exhibition halls, where the boundary between genuine discovery and elaborate trick blurred almost beyond recognition. To be Victorian was to inhabit a world where reason and absurdity walked arm in arm, each lending credibility to the other. Progress was real, but it was also staged. If the grand exhibitions of science offered fireworks and spectacle, everyday Victorian life carried its own quieter absurdities. The strangeness did not always arrive in seances or phrenological lectures, but emerged in the ordinary rituals of daily existence. A respectable gentleman might begin his day with a cold bath, convinced that plunging himself into icy water hardened not only the body, but the moral fiber. Women rose early to lace themselves into corsets while balancing the demands of etiquette manuals that dictated precisely how one ought to speak, sit, and even breathe. Children were instructed not simply in sums and grammar, but in manners so rigid that dropping the wrong spoon at breakfast could bring parental reproach. To live in Victorian Britain was to navigate a maze of rituals, each justified as a mark of civilization, but often amounting to little more than elaborate self-punishment. The morning cold bath was particularly emblematic of the age's peculiar blend of morality and masochism. Physicians extolled its virtues as a cure for latitude, vice, and even the temptation of sinful thoughts. Manuals advised that young men begin each day by shivering violently under a stream of frigid water, emerging invigorated and, more importantly, purified. Women, too, were encouraged to endure the practice, though always with the caveat that modesty must be preserved and fainting politely avoided. The shock to the system was praised as a spiritual tonic, proof that the soul could triumph over flesh. Yet for many, it simply meant beginning each day with a ritual of discomfort that reinforced the Victorian suspicion that pleasure of any kind was inherently suspect. Etiquette governed not only baths and breakfasts, but every interaction, creating a labyrinth of rules that demanded constant vigilance. There were precise forms for visiting a neighbor, with calling cards deposited at correct angles to signal intention. The number of folds in a letter, the cut of a glove, the way one handled a teacup, all could convey messages as powerful as spoken words. Violating these codes risked whispers and exclusion, punishments often more feared than illness itself. A misplaced bow or an ill-timed laugh might suggest vulgarity, and vulgarity suggested moral deficiency. Respectability was not a matter of kindness or honesty, but of endless invisible performances choreographed by the manuals of etiquette that lined respectable bookshelves. Natural history became a mania, with middle-class families amassing cabinets of butterflies, beetles, shells, and dried plants. Children were encouraged to capture insects, pin them neatly, and label them in Latin, rehearsing for lives of classification and control. Adults filled parlors with glass cases of specimens, proud displays of order imposed upon nature. Birds' eggs were particularly coveted, their fragile shells carefully blown out and arranged in boxes. To peer into such a collection was to see the Victorian love of cataloging made literal, the world reduced to labeled fragments. Knowledge was measured not by understanding, but by accumulation, by the ability to display a miniature empire of dead insects beneath glass. The obsession extended beyond nature into the domestic world. Scrapbooks overflowed with cuttings, recipes, patterns, and clippings. Each fragment was preserved with the seriousness of archival work. Families collected autographs, pressed flowers, and copied verses into albums, as though the act of cataloging might itself confer virtue. Libraries multiplied not only for reading, but for display, their bindings carefully chosen to impress visitors. The compulsion to classify and contain reflected a culture uneasy with disorder, determined to impose rules upon even the most trivial of objects. Where industry conquered landscapes, parlors conquered clutter, each shell and butterfly another symbol of dominion over chaos. This mania for order bled into moral life as well. Neighbors watched each other with hawk-like attention, ready to note who wore morning crepes for too short a time, who allowed a child to roam too freely, or who served dinner at an improper hour. Gossip was a form of social policing, and conformity its chief weapon. Sermons reinforced the message, warning against idleness, frivolity, or deviation from duty. The individual lived under constant observation, not always from the state, but from family, parish, and community. To deviate was to risk exclusion, a fate often dreaded more than poverty. Food and drink, already adulterated with chalk and lead, were also enmeshed in etiquette. Tea drinking, for example, was not merely about the beverage, but the performance of refinement. Cups were held at precise angles, conversations carried in tones neither too loud nor too intimate. To take tea incorrectly was to risk appearing common, and appearing common was social death. Meals followed elaborate hierarchies of service, with courses and cutlery arranged like military maneuvers. The act of dining became less about nourishment than about signaling one's place in the social order. Even the simplest supper was freighted with rules, so that eating became another stage upon which respectability was performed. The result was a daily life, thick with rules that often bordered on the absurd. A gentleman might agonize over the correct distance of a bow, while a lady worried about whether to accept a dance card without appearing forward. Children memorized proverbs extolling duty and restraint. Their play was confined to carefully supervised moments that taught obedience as much as amusement. Even leisure required discipline. Strolls in the park demanded the right attire, music lessons, the right posture, and holidays to the right destinations. Nothing was free of scrutiny, for the culture demanded constant reassurance that everyone knew their place and behaved accordingly. What makes this all the more curious is how earnestly it was embraced. The same society that flirted with seances and stuffed kittens for display also produced entire industries devoted to publishing etiquette manuals, moral guides, and catalogs for collectors. People purchased these texts eagerly, convinced that mastery of rules would grant them social stability. In truth, the rules shifted constantly, creating endless anxiety. The line between refinement and ridicule was perilously thin, and missteps were punished disproportionately. Respectability was less a condition than a constant performance, and the energy devoted to sustaining it was staggering. Cold baths left skin goose-pimpled and raw, while starched clothing scratched at the body throughout the day. Parlors reeked faintly of dust and taxidermy, mingling with the acrid smoke of coal and the floral sweetness of potpourri. The weight of etiquette pressed invisibly in every room, a suffocating reminder that no gesture was too small to be policed. A household might appear calm and orderly, but beneath the surface it seethed with anxiety, each family member rehearsing lines in a play where mistakes were unforgivable. To live in such a world was to endure a constant friction between the appearance of order and the reality of strain. This obsession with order and propriety reveals the paradox at the heart of Victorian life. An age that prided itself on progress and innovation was simultaneously strangled by its own rules. The same people who marveled at locomotives and electric lights measured teaspoons of etiquette at tea, catalogued beetles with manic care, and began each day with acts of deliberate discomfort. Beneath the grandeur of empire and the triumph of science, daily existence was bizarrely constrained, filled with rituals that achieved little beyond reinforcing conformity. The Victorians imagined themselves rational and enlightened, yet their lives were crowded with rituals as absurd as any seance or freak show. And so, The strangeness of the Victorian age was not confined to its poisons, fashions, or entertainments. It seeped into every corner of domestic, social, and intellectual life, creating a world that was at once orderly, theatrical, and perilously strange. It seeped into the very routines of ordinary households, shaping how people washed, ate, spoke, and even thought. Beneath the veneer of progress lay a culture obsessed with control, terrified of disorder, and endlessly inventive in devising rules that disguised anxieties as refinement. This contradiction, more than any specific oddity, defined the age. The empire might have built railways across continents, but its citizens still measured their worth by spoons, bows, and butterflies. In that paradox, we glimpse the true absurdity of Victorian life, a stage upon which innovation and repression performed side by side. The Victorians congratulated themselves endlessly on living in the most advanced age the world had ever seen. They pointed to their railways, telegraphs, and expanding empire, and to their grand exhibitions of industry, as proof that progress had finally triumphed over ignorance. Britain was the model of civilization, rational, enlightened, destined to lead the world. And yet, the same men and women who boasted of science and refinement lived in houses lined with arsenic wallpaper, wore clothes that could burst into flames, and sent their children to sleep with a spoonful of opium. They sat for seances, collected hair from the dead, and admired the spectacle of trained monkeys or stuffed kittens at tea. Progress may have defined the rhetoric of the age, but daily life was steeped in poisons, absurdities, and delusions. The contradiction was glaring, but rarely admitted. To be Victorian was to live in a world where superstition wore the costume of science and danger masqueraded as refinement. A society that prided itself on rationality was at the same time obsessed with spiritualism, mesmerism, and phrenology. People that claimed to value morality dressed themselves in fire traps, poisoned their food for profit, and measured their neighbor's worth by the length of their morning crepe. They expanded outward in iron and steam, while collapsing inward into rituals of control and fear. The paradox was not hidden from them, but disguised beneath the language of progress. If they suffered, it was not a sign of folly, but of virtue. Discomfort, illness, and even death were reframed as the price of refinement. The age's obsession with control explains much of its strangeness. Death was not left to chance, but staged through elaborate mourning rituals. Homes were not allowed to exist naturally, but were covered in patterns that poisoned their inhabitants. Clothing did not simply cover the body, but disciplined it into shapes that damaged lungs and organs. Medicine was less about healing than about enforcing a narrative of vitality and moral seriousness, regardless of the harm it inflicted. Even daily life, from tea to calling cards, was smothered in rules. Progress meant not only building railways and factories, but creating endless codes of behavior that assured Victorians they were more civilized than their ancestors. Yet beneath the surface, this very order revealed a society terrified of chaos, endlessly inventing rituals to conceal its anxieties. Ironically, the dangers were not hidden secrets, but widely known. Newspapers carried stories of women burned alive in crinolines, children sickened by lead candies, families felled by arsenic wallpaper. Doctors issued warnings, reformers lobbied for change, yet the practices continued. What mattered was not safety, but appearance. A house without fashionable wallpaper risked looking shabby. A family without mourning attire risked appearing unfeeling. And a woman without a corset risked being called indecent. The hazards were acknowledged but tolerated, because to abandon them was to risk ridicule. Civilization, in this sense, was less about advancement than endurance, the willingness to suffer and even die in order to appear refined. This willingness reveals the irony at the heart of Victorian progress. The railways and factories that symbolized modernity also produced soot that blackened lungs. Scientific breakthroughs promised enlightenment, but were accompanied by quack devices and fraudulent spectacles. The industrial system that fed the empire also filled stomachs with chalk, lead, and sawdust. The same society that prized morality tolerated cruelty to animals and turned human difference into a sideshow. They were forward-looking and backward at the same time, balancing genuine innovation with practices that seemed grotesquely medieval from a distance. For all their sermons on progress, They lived in a theater of contradictions, where superstition and science performed side by side. Yet to laugh too freely at their absurdities is to risk ignoring our own. The Victorians did not think themselves strange. They believed they were modern, enlightened, and rational just as we do now. They defended their poisons as harmless, their rituals as necessary, their entertainments as educational. Every folly was justified by the standards of its day. Their faith in progress blinded them to the ways in which they endangered themselves, just as our faith in technology and innovation may blind us to hazards we accept without question. They were convinced their lives were the pinnacle of refinement, unaware that posterity would marvel at their arsenic wallpapers and belladonna eye drops with horrified amusement. There is something uncomfortably familiar in this pattern. Just as Victorians clung to corsets and laudanum, we cling to our own dangerous comforts, whether in processed foods, addictive technologies, or environmental choices that quietly poison our world. Just as they accepted that beauty required suffering, we accept that convenience requires compromise. Their poisons were vivid and immediate. Ours are often invisible and deferred. But the underlying logic is the same. Progress is always a bargain struck between aspiration and folly, dressed in the conviction that this time, unlike all others, we finally know better. The Victorian story is therefore less a tale of peculiar ancestors than a mirror. It shows us that human beings are endlessly capable of justifying danger, cruelty, and absurdity when cloaked in the language of refinement. It shows how readily we mistake performance for truth, appearance for morality, spectacle for substance. Their age was crowded with contradictions because all ages are. They remind us with their arsenic greens and stuffed kittens that civilization is rarely as rational as it claims. The Victorians were not uniquely strange. Their poisons and rituals make them easy targets for mockery, yet their oddities are simply expressions of a universal human tendency. Progress, after all, is just another form of fashion. And fashions, however lethal, are always worn with pride. And that brings us to the end of this journey, not the polished image of Victorian progress with locomotives and glass palaces, but the reality of arsenic wallpaper, flammable skirts, lead-laced suites, and seances performed in gaslit parlors. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. Sleep well.